The people who will cost you the most in this life will never announce themselves as threats. They will arrive at your door with food, call you by your name, and tell you they only want what is best for you. Nobody warned you about this because the warning sounds like betrayal, and they taught you that questioning the family is the one sin that cannot be forgiven. Niccolò Machiavelli spent his entire career inside the most dangerous courts in human history, watching power transfer, collapse, and get destroyed, and what he documented was not what enemies do to powerful men, but what the people closest to them do. He wrote rules so precise and so threatening that the institutions of his era banned them publicly and studied them privately. What he understood about family, loyalty, and the hidden architecture of control is what most men spend their entire lives learning too late. Today, that changes. The people who limit you the most are not the ones who openly oppose you. They are the ones who smile at you across the dinner table, use your childhood name, and genuinely believe that what they are doing to your ambition is protection. You have felt this your entire life, and you have never been able to name it cleanly, because the moment you try to name it, the guilt arrives before the sentence is finished, and the guilt was installed by the same system that is currently holding you in place. That is not coincidence, that is architecture. Every family is a system before it is a relationship, and every system has one biological imperative that supersedes love, supersedes loyalty, and supersedes the genuine affection that may exist between the people inside it, and that imperative is survival, specifically the survival of the current arrangement, the current balance of roles, the current story the family tells about itself and every person inside it. You were assigned a role in that story before you were old enough to audition for it, and the role came with a ceiling, and the ceiling was not placed there out of malice. It was placed there because the system required it, because a system that allows one member to ascend without limit destabilizes the equilibrium that every other member has organized their identity around. When you begin to exceed that ceiling, when your income grows beyond what the family expected, when your thinking evolves past the ideology they raised you in, when your ambition begins to take a shape that does not fit the chapter they wrote for you, the system does not celebrate the disruption, it corrects it, and the correction comes dressed in the most disarming language available to the human species. It comes dressed as concern. Machiavelli spent his career embedded in the courts of Renaissance Florence, watching the most powerful families in Europe manage, manipulate, and systematically destroy their own members when those members grew beyond what the family structure required them to be. And what he documented was not the cruelty of evil people, it was the automatic, self-preserving intelligence of human systems operating exactly as human systems are designed to operate. He did not moralize about what he saw. He did not prescribe remedies. He did not comfort the men being consumed by the systems they were born into. He simply described the mechanics with the cold precision of a surgeon, describing an anatomy, because he understood that the man who sees the mechanism clearly is the only man with any chance of surviving it. He wrote that men are not governed primarily by love or loyalty in the abstract. They are governed by interest, by the preservation of what they have, by the protection of the position they occupy and the story they need to believe about themselves to maintain it. And the most threatening thing you can do to a person who has accepted a limited life is to refuse to accept the same limitation in their presence. Your success is not neutral to the people around you who settled. It is a mirror, and the reflection is unbearable, and the unbearable reflection will be managed not through honest confrontation, but through the quiet, persistent erosion of your belief in what you are building. Here is how it operates in the daily reality of your life. Not in theory, but in the specific texture of interactions you have been navigating for years without the language to describe what was actually happening. You make a significant decision, a business, an investment, a departure from the expected path, and you bring it to the family because they are your family, because you were taught that family is your foundation, because the mythology of unconditional support is so deeply installed in you that the act of sharing feels like the natural and correct thing to do. Within 24 hours, the first concern arrives. Framed carefully, delivered warmly, wrapped in precisely the language that makes it impossible to reject without appearing defensive, and you register something uncomfortable in your chest, but you cannot name it as opposition because it sounds so much like love. Within a week, the concern has traveled, has been discussed in conversations you were not part of, has gathered the collective weight of the family's shared anxiety about disruption, and has returned to you not as one person's hesitation, but as a unified position. And you are now not having a conversation with your family. You are facing a consensus that formed without you, using information you provided, arriving at a conclusion that was probably inevitable from the moment you opened your mouth. The question you need to sit with is not whether their concern is genuine. The question is what their concern is actually protecting, because it is not protecting your future. It is protecting the arrangement that requires your future to remain predictable, manageable, and safely within the boundaries of what the system has already accounted for. The philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer, a man so ruthlessly accurate about human psychology that his contemporaries called him a misanthrope rather than confront what he was describing, spent decades documenting the invisible war between exceptional individuals and the mediocre environments that surround them, and he identified something that should permanently change how you interpret the resistance you have been experiencing. He wrote that the display of superior ability in the presence of mediocrity does not produce admiration. It produces a specific visceral discomfort that the mediocre person cannot consciously acknowledge, because acknowledging it would require them to confront the disparity between what you are building and what they accepted, and the ego will dismantle a person's entire logic before it accepts that level of self-examination. So instead of confronting the discomfort directly, the system routes it through available channels: concern, skepticism, historical references to your past failures, questions about your judgment, and every single one of those channels is genuine in its emotional delivery while being structurally opposed to your expansion, which is precisely why it is so difficult to defend against and so exhausting to navigate. The opposition you have been fighting is not cynical, it is sincere. And the sincerity of it is what makes it so effective, because you cannot dismiss sincere opposition from people you love without the guilt mechanism engaging immediately, and the guilt mechanism was installed by the same people whose sincere opposition you are trying to dismiss. History is not abstract on this point. History is a detailed record of what happens to men who assume that shared blood provides immunity from the dynamics of human self-interest, and the record is consistent across centuries with a precision that should alarm you. Joseph, whose story is documented in one of the oldest texts in human civilization, was not destroyed by strangers or undermined by competitors. He was sold into slavery by his own brothers, men who shared his blood, his childhood, his parents, his table, and his God, and the mechanism that drove them was not hatred in its pure form, but the specific, unbearable psychological pressure of watching one member of the system receive elevation that the rest had not been assigned. They did not sell him because he wronged them. They sold him because his elevation made their ordinariness visible, and the human ego, operating below the level of conscious morality, resolved the unbearable imbalance, not by elevating itself, but by eliminating the source of the comparison. He spent years in a foreign prison for the crime of being exceptional in an environment that required him to be ordinary, and the men who put him there did not understand what they had done to themselves, because the man they tried to contain became, through the very suffering they imposed on him, something so far beyond their containment that their original act of suppression became the mechanism of his ascension. That pattern has repeated in every culture, every era, every family structure that has ever existed, which means it is not a historical curiosity, it is a feature of human psychology operating beneath conscious choice, and understanding it does not make you cynical, it makes you competent. Marcus Aurelius, the Stoic emperor who commanded the most powerful empire on earth, while managing a court full of people who wanted what he had, did not write about his inner life for public consumption. He wrote in private, in a journal never intended for anyone else's eyes, and what he wrote about the people in his most intimate circle was the practiced discipline of a man who had decided to stop being surprised by what human beings do when their interests are at stake. He wrote that when he woke each morning, he prepared himself to encounter the ungrateful, the deceitful, the envious, and the arrogant, and he was not writing about strangers, he was writing about the people inside the palace, the people at the table, and his practice was not to hate them for being human, but to stop constructing a fantasy about human nature that their behavior would inevitably destroy. The man who expects his family to operate outside of human psychology has built his entire strategy on a foundation that reality will eventually collapse, and the collapse always happens at the worst possible moment, when the stakes are highest and the decision is most critical, because those are precisely the moments when the system applies maximum pressure to return you to your assigned position. There is a psychological trap that operates so quietly inside family dynamics that most men carry it for decades without identifying it, and it is responsible for more derailed ambitions than any external opposition could ever produce. You are in a moment of genuine vulnerability. The business is struggling, the timeline has shifted, the confidence that felt solid last month is flickering, and you are sitting with a family member who loves you, and the room feels safe, and you say something honest about the uncertainty of what you are building. They hold it with care, they respond with warmth, and you feel the relief of having named the weight to someone who received it with love, and then you return to the work, and the work progresses, and the doubt you expressed gets resolved by the execution that follows it. But the confession does not get resolved. The confession lives in that person permanently, filed in the category of evidence about who you are and what you are capable of, and the next time the family system requires a reason to question your direction, the filing cabinet opens, and the thing you said in your most vulnerable moment becomes the most convincing argument against your most ambitious vision. They will not deploy it maliciously, they will deploy it with complete sincerity, because they genuinely remember you saying it and genuinely believe they are protecting you from repeating a pattern you yourself identified, and the protection feels like love in their body, even as it functions as a cage around your expansion. Machiavelli's instruction on this was absolute. The prince does not share his doubts with the court, he shares his decisions, because a court that witnesses doubt begins calculating exits and preparing for instability, while a court that only ever witnesses confident final decisions remains organized around the certainty of the man at the center. Your family is not your court, but the psychology is identical. Carry the weight of the unresolved privately, convert it into execution alone, and present only the result to the people whose perception of your capacity must remain calibrated to what you are building, not to the worst night you experienced while building it. Now the financial dimension, because this is the one most men understand intellectually but consistently fail to protect in practice, and the failure costs them in ways that compound over years into structural constraints on everything they are trying to build. The family that knows the size of your financial capacity does not just know a number, they know leverage, not because they are calculating it strategically, but because human beings automatically recalibrate their relationship to risk the moment they become aware of a safety net that belongs to someone they are close to. Your brother, who should be managing his finances with greater discipline, does not feel the full weight of that responsibility when he knows your account exists. The knowledge of your resources has altered his perception of the consequences of his own irresponsibility without a single conversation, without any explicit negotiation, simply through the information being present in his awareness. The emergencies that require your financial intervention will multiply in direct proportion to your known financial capacity, and the requests will not arrive as manipulation, they will arrive as genuine crises framed with real emotion, delivered by people who love you and are also simultaneously relying on the arrangement your visibility created. Cosimo de' Medici, who controlled banking relationships across Renaissance Europe, financed the papacy, and held more concentrated wealth than most governments of his era, projected such deliberate modesty that contemporaries routinely underestimated him, and Machiavelli studied this as a fundamental law of power. Visible wealth is a tax, and the collectors are always closest to home. The man who conceals the architecture of what he is building is not being deceptive, he is being strategic about who gets to interact with his resources before those resources are fully protected, because every person who knows the scope of what you are building also knows the scope of what they can ask you to interrupt. There is a concept in clinical psychology that explains the most sophisticated and least visible mechanism of family control, and once you see it, you will recognize it everywhere. And the recognition will explain years of confusion about why certain dynamics in your family have persisted despite your repeated attempts to address them rationally. It is called the identified patient, the process by which a family system that operates through covert control, unspoken rules, guilt as enforcement, and the suppression of individual ambition unconsciously selects one member to carry the visible symptom of the system's dysfunction. That member becomes the problem, the difficult one, the dramatic one, the one who always causes disruption, and the rest of the family unites around the shared management of this person, which creates a sense of collective identity and purpose the system depends on for its cohesion. The precision of this mechanism is dark. The identified patient is almost never the actual source of the dysfunction. They are the person sensitive enough to feel it, aware enough to name it, and strong enough to resist the role the system assigned them, which means the system targets the person whose awareness represents the greatest threat to its continued concealment. If you have spent years being labeled the difficult one, the one who disrupts the family peace, the question worth sitting with is not whether the label is accurate, but what you are seeing and resisting that made your awareness a threat, requiring containment. The label was not a diagnosis, it was a management strategy, and now that you can see the mechanism, the management strategy loses its power because you cannot cage a man who understands the architecture of the cage and has stopped pretending the bars are made of love. Seneca, who served as advisor to Emperor Nero and watched that proximity to corrupted power nearly destroy him, wrote something about association and environment that has survived 2,000 years because the psychology it describes has not changed. He wrote that you must associate with those who will make a better man of you, and the operative principle is that the direction of influence in any relationship is not neutral, it is always flowing towards someone, and the man who does not consciously choose the direction allows the direction to be chosen by the strongest current in the environment, which in a family system is almost always the current flowing toward the ceiling the system has already accepted. The most dangerous ceiling is not the one you can see and name and fight. It is the one built so gradually from the accumulated weight of conversations, tones, and expectations that you begin to experience it as your own skepticism rather than the imported limitation of an environment that needed you to stay small. There is a moment in almost every ambitious man's life that he remembers differently than it actually happened, and the difference is the gap between a story that protects his comfort and a truth that would require him to reorganize everything he thought he understood about the people he loves most. The moment is the one where he first tried to express the full scope of what he wanted to build, the real ambition, the version that felt almost embarrassing to say out loud because of how large it was, and the response he received shaped his relationship to expressing that ambition for years afterward. If the response was skepticism delivered with warmth, he learned to preemptively qualify his ambition before presenting it, to make it smaller and more reasonable before offering it to the room. If the response was laughter, the specific laughter of people who love you and find your ambition charming in the way adults find a child's fantasy charming, he learned that the vision was not taken seriously by the people whose seriousness he needed, and the fracture that created between his internal reality and his social relationships is one he has been trying to reconcile ever since. None of those responses required malice. They required nothing more than human beings responding to large ambition with the automatic calibration of people whose own experience taught them that large ambition was dangerous or the province of other people, and that calibration was delivered to you as reality before you had the capacity to evaluate whether it was accurate. The work now is not to blame them for the transmission. The work is to examine what was transmitted and decide, with the full capacity of the man you have become, whether you are going to keep carrying an inherited ceiling as if it were your own. Nietzsche, who produced some of the most psychologically precise observations about exceptional individuals ever committed to writing, wrote that the higher a man rises, the smaller he appears to those who cannot fly. He was not writing about arrogance. He was writing about the mechanical reality of perception, the fact that elevation produces apparent distance, and apparent distance in the psychology of intimate relationships reads as abandonment, and the family that experiences your growth as abandonment will apply the same pressure to your ascending as it would apply to your departure, because from the ground the two are visually identical. The man who ascends and then descends to manage the perceptions of people who cannot see where he was standing has not demonstrated loyalty. He has demonstrated the specific failure of nerve that Nietzsche identified as the primary obstacle between exceptional people and their exceptional lives, the inability to tolerate being misunderstood by people whose understanding has previously felt essential to his sense of identity. Fly, and let their perception of your flight be their experience, not the boundary of yours, because the alternative is a life spent at an altitude calibrated not to your capacity, but to the comfort of people who would have loved you just as sincerely at any altitude, and who will eventually adjust their story about what was possible for you to match wherever you finally stop ascending. Now the operational principles, because everything in this video reaches its value only at the point where it changes your actual behavior in the actual situations you will encounter this week. The first principle is that you execute before you announce, without exception, because the plan that exists only as a plan is vulnerable to every form of psychological opposition available to the people you love, while the plan that has already been executed is a result, and results speak in a language that doubt cannot argue with because the argument has already been resolved by the evidence. The second principle is that you give the people in your family the version of your life appropriate to their role, not a deceptive version, but a controlled version that contains the information necessary for a healthy relationship and withholds the information that exists only to be absorbed by their anxiety and returned to you as opposition at the moment you can least afford it. The third principle is that you carry the weight of the unresolved alone and without apology, because the discouraged version of your ambition placed in the hands of a system that requires your limitation will be preserved and referenced for years after you have resolved the discouragement through execution, and the family's memory of your doubt will outlast your own experience of it. The fourth principle is that you never confuse the love that exists in the relationship with the operational intelligence required to manage the system that relationship exists inside. The man who loves his family and manages the system clearly loves them better than the man who confuses love with exposure, because the man who stops feeding the system's control mechanisms removes the primary source of friction that was preventing the love from being experienced as love rather than as leverage. The fifth principle is that you build the inner citadel. Marcus Aurelius wrote about the private interior architecture that cannot be accessed by the opinions, concerns, or disappointment of the people closest to you. Not because you are cold, but because a man without a private interior is a man whose direction is determined by whatever voice reached him most recently, and that man does not build anything the people around him did not already sanction. Carl Jung identified something about family dynamics that extends far beyond the individual family and reaches into the generational architecture of limitation itself. He described the shadow not as personal darkness in the simplistic sense popular psychology has reduced it to, but as the accumulated unconscious of unresolved material passed between generations through the invisible transmission of behavior, silence, expectation, and the unspoken rules governing what is permitted and what is punished in the family environment. Your family's ceiling is not original to them. It was transmitted to them the same way they are transmitting it to you, each generation inheriting not just the material circumstances of the previous generation, but the psychological limits that prevented the previous generation from transcending those circumstances. The chain does not break through blame. The people who transmitted the ceiling to you received it themselves and passed it on without knowing it was a transmission, which means the person responsible for breaking the chain is not the person who created it, but the person who sees it clearly enough to step deliberately out of its path. That person is you, making the decision not dramatically, not with the performance of rebellion, but quietly and operationally, with the discipline of a man who has decided that his love for the people in his family and his commitment to the full scope of his potential are not competing claims, and that honoring both requires understanding exactly where each one belongs. The goal of understanding your family system with this level of precision is not distance, it is the specific kind of freedom that makes genuine closeness possible for the first time, because the man who is no longer seeking his family's validation before he acts is no longer managing the wound of their non-support after he has acted, which means he can sit at the dinner table without the invisible tension of a man who needs something from the room that the room is not providing. The man who has separated his operational life from his relational life, who builds without their approval and loves without their comprehension, is the man who can actually be present in the relationship, because the relationship is no longer carrying the weight of his ambition's survival, and that weight was always too heavy for a relationship to carry cleanly. Machiavelli's entire philosophy resolves into this: see things as they are, operate accordingly, and do not allow the gap between how things are and how you wish they were to become the vulnerability through which everything you are building gets dismantled by people who love you and cannot see clearly enough to know what they are doing. See the system, love the people, protect the work, and keep moving with the specific, unwavering momentum of a man who understands that the only response to a ceiling is to pass through it, and that the people standing beneath it will adjust their story about what was possible for you to match where you eventually land, and their revised story will contain no memory of the resistance, and you will not correct them because you will be too occupied with what comes next. If this video reached something real in you, if any part of this named a pattern you have been living inside without the language to describe it, like this video, because that action tells me this content found the person it was built for. If you are not subscribed, subscribe now, because this channel does not produce content designed to make you comfortable. It produces content designed to make you clear, and clarity in this niche is the scarcest and most valuable resource available to a man who is serious about what he is trying to build. Now, everything delivered in this video represents the version of this conversation that this platform permits, and there is a version that goes significantly further, examining the mechanics of psychological defense, covert manipulation, dark influence architecture, and the specific operational frameworks for navigating the most sophisticated forms of human control that most men encounter daily without the vocabulary to identify what is happening to them. That conversation does not exist here because the algorithm is not neutral, it has interests, and the sharpest truths do not align with those interests, and the content that challenges the most deeply installed psychological mechanisms tends to disappear from the surfaces where most people would encounter it. It exists behind the join button below, inside a small and deliberately limited circle of men who have decided that operating with incomplete information is a disadvantage they are no longer willing to accept. Men who understand that access to the real mechanics of power and psychological defense is not a luxury, it is the difference between navigating the game clearly and spending your life responding to moves you cannot see coming. The join button is below, and the men who press it know exactly why they are pressing it, and both outcomes are acceptable because the circle is small by design, and the value inside it compounds in direct proportion to the seriousness of the people inside it. You stayed until the end of a video about the most uncomfortable truth in most men's lives, and that discipline, the refusal to leave before the full weight of something had been delivered, is precisely the quality that separates the men who change from the men who consume content about changing without ever executing the change. Carry what this video gave you into the specific situations waiting for you this week, because the understanding is only as valuable as the behavior it produces, and you now have the clarity. What you reveal, you surrender. What you protect, you keep. And the family system cannot contain what it cannot see coming. I will see you in the next one.